Привет! Сегодня к нам присоединилась Сабина. Сабина — независимый контент-директор, специализируется на цифровом повествовании, digital storytelling, и любит работать с данными и рассказывать на их основе истории. Она работала в команде в связке с разными специалистами, разработчиками, аналитиками, иллюстраторами, дизайнерами. Она работала редактором Infographics Group в Берлине. Сегодня эта студия называется Сапера. Над проектами для музеев, издателей для Lufthansa Group. Она была редактором книги The World Explained in 264 Infographics. Запустила онлайн-журнал Infographics. Возможно, вы видели в рассылке, посмотрели. Я думаю, что сегодня Сабина об этом расскажет. И также искала новые пути для сторителлинга в соцсетях. Можно еще назвать также The Wall Street Journal, Spiegel Online и дизайн-студию Figure.cc. Sabina, let me give you the host rights. You can share your screen and we can start. Just a moment.
Thank you.
There was a brilliant curriculum vitae.
Well, I'm thank you. Thank you, Oksana, for what I assume is the very nice introduction. But if I know you, then I'm just going to share my whole desktop because I want to switch around a little bit. I'm going to put that away, and that is also not ours. My whole life is just keynote presentations right now. So, but here we are. And play. I can't see the chat when I'm presenting my screen, but I will kind of check in every now and then to sort of see it. Oops, I don't know why it's showing the videos, but here we are. I'm Sabina, as Oksana said. I do data-driven storytelling. I'm a content director, and for me, it's always very interesting to find what is the story behind the numbers. So that's me right now. I work in interdisciplinary teams. So I work with developers, I work with designers, I work with strategists, I work with a whole bunch of other things. And I kind of see myself as something that kind of goes in the middle to sort of bring everybody on board to create a story. And I like to create stories from data that are, oops, I'm making it, there we go, accessible, oops. Accessible, explanatory, and engaging. So those are sort of the three things that I really look for in creating a good data story. Accessible means that everyone can kind of understand it, or at least the users or the audience that we are creating the story from. Explanatory means that we don't just create something that is there and looks nice, but also takes people through what the story is or what the explanation is. And engaging also meaning that it's interesting for people to read. I always find it important to say I'm not a data scientist, even though I do a lot of work with data. I see myself as a data detective, but data detectives are still nerdy, so she still gets the nerdy glasses when I do this. I started with digital journalism, where I think this is really important to my experience, because when you're a journalist, you're always dealing with sort of happenings and things that are going on around the world. And you kind of have to figure out what is the story and where are we going with this. So when I was doing that, I worked for international publications. I worked for, here in Germany, I did The Local, which is Germany's news in English. I also worked for Handelsblatt Global, which is a German business newspaper, but also in English. I've written stories for Wall Street Journal, produced stories for Voice of America. I've even had the opportunity to work for National Geographic, which is amazing. And on all of these things, it was always really important to me, to the team, to whatever we were doing, that we really not just sort of talk about what happened, but why things are happening. And that was always my favorite part of journalism. And this is something that I was able to apply very well with, but yeah. So what I was looking at, when I was working at Handelsblatt Global, Brexit happened. And I found, and this chart was kind of everywhere. And this chart is the course of the pound after the leave announcement was we all kind of reported about how the pound was suddenly 20% less. But we weren't talking as journalists or as the media to talk about what exactly that means. And what was interesting was sort of in the background, I was having with conversations with British people who were saying, my house is suddenly 20% less, is worth 20% less, or businesses that were operating from the UK in Europe had to suddenly create a whole bunch of cutbacks because they had less money. And families were also kind of concerned about their retirement because, you know, that was also 20% less money that they suddenly had. And there were all these human stories that were kind of coming out of Brexit that weren't being shown in this chart, where we were just talking about the monetary value, but not talking about the human value that was coming through to this. But at that time, or shortly thereafter, I had the opportunity to sort of make this explanation my job when I got hired as the managing editor at the infographics group, which today is Sapera. So when I started working there, it was a very graphic, it was just very graphic heavy talents, and all very great, but incredibly successful behind, like successful publications behind them. And I kind of came in, we had two researchers who were relatively new hires, and we had a whole bunch of graphic designers who themselves had been kind of creating these stories for a magazine called In Graphics. But there had been a wish to sort of modernize and digitize the whole thing. And there was an opportunity for me to kind of come in and create a whole editorial force with this. When we did it, in which we started the info.graphics page. So we took In Graphics magazine and digitalized it. And so going from print to digital and also in the end going backwards is kind of what I'm going to be focusing my cases that I'm going to be showing you today. So when I was looking at digitalizing these stories, this is a very typical kind of magazine page that we had coming out of In Graphics magazine. So this story was really about the gold. And I mean, it was just everything about gold. It was just a whole bunch of data visualizations about gold. And the first graphic designer who kind of turned this into a story, and like the way that we were presenting them, it was almost like a slide share sort of situation. And what she had done was really broken down every single one of these graphics into a single story, and or not even a single story, just a single image. And so in the end, what the reader was getting was just a bunch of facts of gold. When you were looking at it in print, these kinds of pages invite people to sort of pore over them, look at them, sort of study them. But when you're looking at what web does, we're a bit more fluid and we can be a bit more flexible and go in a bit more detail with these things. So what I wound up doing with this one, or what wound up kind of emerging from it, was that I sort of said, what's the story, or which one of these actually tells a story? And we kind of focused on this chart right here. And this is the price of gold through time. And it's a very spiky chart. And so we wind up kind of took the whole user into sort of this scrolly telling thing, where we used the price of gold as basically a timeline, and suggested and sort of looked at like, what were the things that were driving it? What created the change? Why is it that when the US economy goes bad, the price of gold goes up? And so we were really looking at what could we do, and how can we sort of create a story out of this data, and how can we create an explanation for people on this thing that's very sort of always reoccurring, which also was important to us as a site. So that's what we had. That's what we had going there. Okay, there's a lot of Russian there, so I don't have to respond to anything yet. Whoops, I want to take the chat away. Sorry, I want to just, how do I make this go away? I'm gonna do a new share so I can just go on my Keynote, and then maybe you can see it better. So other stories that we kind of looked at, can you still see the chat window, or is it just me? No? We're okay?
Just you, I think.
Okay, perfect. Then it's okay. Thank you. So when we also sort of looked for stories that we could kind of conceptualize new for our digital platform. And we had, at that time, a data analyst working for us who sort of found this data set of when every piece of the German Autobahn was built. And we wanted to create a story out of that. Initially, we thought we would kind of create a map like the one that you see now, but animate it as a GIF where you would see it on social media, where you could kind of see the web of streets kind of growing together and covering Germany as time went on. But when we kind of thought about that, we're like, okay, that's great, but so what? What's the point behind those signs? It's an aesthetic thing that gets shared. It's great for content promotion, but it doesn't really tell the user very much when we actually have a very detailed kind of list of things that we could go to. So what we wound up doing with this, when we were talking about sort of the storytelling, again, we took a timeline of history and explained how Germany's history is kind of seen in the development of the Autobahn, from sort of the pre-war times to the divisions of like East versus West Germany, to our sports events, as well as reunification, are all kind of evidenced in this data of when roads get built in Germany. And so in that way, we had an infographic that showed how the street was changing, but what we also had was the story of a country's development. Also to that, we did a lot of, I'm just going to share a different screen now. So also with that, we created a video. And when we did the video, we had to kind of think about something else, because we wanted to, and with the video, we had an opportunity to, hold on, and move you guys over here. Technical difficulties. When we had the video, I'm going to unplug my headphones so you guys. We used this opportunity to, can you still hear me? We used this opportunity to create a snippet or like a short story. This was something that was else in the data, but we hadn't been able to incorporate it into the story because it sort of was something else, but still relevant. But what we did is we kind of created a storyboard where we used the data to sort of drive the story along. And this is the story of the speed record that was set on the German Autobahn. So I'll play it so you can also see how the difference between when we're developing for web versus when we're developing for video is something else too.
One January morning, bright and early, Rudolf Caracciola, a famous race car driver, set out in his modified Mercedes W125 and set a record. He had 432.7 kilometers, which is the fastest anyone has ever driven on the German Autobahn. Today, that record has stood for 80 years. That's right, it was set in 1938. The piece of road that record was set on is one of the first pieces of the Autobahn ever built, and its opening was a big bit of propaganda for the Nazis. Even Adolf Hitler came to the party. On the same day that Caracciola set his record, Hitler's favorite racer, Bernd Hosmeyer, set out to beat it in his car built by the Auto Union. But his attempt ended when a cross gust of wind lifted the body off the car as Hosmeyer topped 400 kilometers an hour. He died instantly. Today, the site is marked by a memorial at a rest stop on the A5, where drivers can go any speed they want, but Caracciola's record from way back then, it still stands.
So yeah, so there you see how when we are focusing on video, we really focus on telling a different kind of story, or telling, just focusing on a story that we can sort of tell in a minute. Also thinking about, where do people consume this? And we really focus on one element and try and keep one focus point to tell the story. So whereas with our web story, we had a wide range of video or of stories that we were sort of sharing. or sort of a timeline, or several data points, actually, several data points that we were telling in one story. With the video, we really kind of went in depth with one data point to create a compelling story for that. So that's how we took this topic, and where we kind of sort of expanded ourselves from looking at this stuff to creating a video out of that as well. And this is also, I'm gonna switch. So now we're kind of also focusing on time data. And this is a story that we wound up doing and this is a story that we wound up creating. So we've now done websites, we've now done videos, we've gone from print to digital, and now we're going to look at a story that we did for social media. So for 100 years of women's, just a second, sorry. Yes, Mateo. Yep, bye. Tell him I say hi. So for 100 years of voting rights in Germany, we wanted to do something for this. And we had this data set. We wanted to kind of look at when every country got the voting rights, whether Germany had. And when we looked at this data, we saw that Germany, as you can see, is in the middle of this huge spike of European countries that all granted women the right to vote in the same year, in 1919, just after the First World War ended. And we kind of thought, oh, just a second, I have to let my son in. Just a moment, thank you.
Надя?
Да-да.
Ты меня слышишь?
Да.
Ну, я думаю, ты сможешь в конце задать этот вопрос. Просто...
Да, я уже записываю его, сделала себе заметку.
Окей.
Там в чат написать, чтобы не забыть и понять это уже. Либо я это могу сделать, если хочешь.
I'm back. Okay, so as I was saying, we had Germany, they had given their rights to vote 100 or just after the First World War. And it made us ask a lot of questions about where this came from. Like, was this just the trendy thing to do? Was it sort of a long time coming? Was it maybe because all the men had died in the First World War, so women took the opportunity to give themselves the right to vote? We asked ourselves a lot of questions. And at the same time that we were researching this, we also thought about, I was thinking about how Me Too was happening and how this huge network of women was coming together to create a change. And I thought, maybe there's a network behind this. So we started researching it. And we came up with the crazy wall. And this was an actual wall. It's a whiteboard that we had in our office. And we looked at like all the things that had happened in Germany to give women, the German women, the right to vote. And what was interesting is that this wasn't just a German story. This wasn't because of the suffragettes. Like, I had always been under the impression that the British suffragettes had made it happen for all women around the world. That's not true. The suffragettes actually came quite late. They were first in 1920 or 21. And the German women had this really wide, almost spoke German, really wide, well-built network where they could sort of show where everything was. So we created this crazy wall showing the network and time and people and events that happened, but it was a wall in our office. And in order, we were like, how do we show this to people? Or how do we make this understandable? Because you're looking at it now, you can't see anything, you can't read anything, it's kind of a mess. And so I said, you know, let's make it into a microsite. And at the time, our developers were all booked, busy building the infrastructure that became our magazine later, the info.graphics site. So I came up with a concept that we would create it for Instagram. And I used the infrastructure of Instagram to create a microsite. So we had the central graphic showing things. We connected it to the profile that we made of 6 heroes with sort of biographies of everybody. There's a text box in the middle, I'm sorry. I don't know where that came from. I'm gonna delete this and take that again. So there you see our Instagram. We have the 3 sort of the ways that the networks were working. We created profiles for people, for 6 heroes of each of the movement. You could click on the profiles and get a little biography of what they had done, where they had kind of created change for women in this time. And then using the hashtags, we connected the women to show who worked together on what and in what organizations or which events. So that way you could kind of see whether this group collaborated with another group and where they went. We also used other things in Instagram to sort of improve our discoverability. For example, Instagram lets you geotag things. So we geotagged the places where history happened, which would let readers kind of discover these things and sort of explore the places that this history had happened. Yeah, and so the idea behind this was that we were taking first wave feminism to the platform where fourth wave feminists were happening. From a design standpoint, what we had to sort of consider was that like our overall picture created a single picture, but that each individual picture could still tell a part of the story. So that was one of the challenges when we were creating the storyboard. Also creating the storyboards for our 6 people, even choosing just 6 people to feature in our little microsite that we made was a challenge because there were really so many more people involved, but we looked for the names that kept coming up. We even had a man sort of part of the group because we wanted to also show how allyship was really important in feminist movements. And yeah. Today, you can explore this graphic for yourselves. It has its own profile at Frauenwahlrecht by SD, so that everything is linked, everything is cleared. We also wanted to create a graphic that would be sort of give people one layer of information, and if they were interested, they can kind of dig through and explore a little bit more of the history that went into granting German women the rights to vote, and also see how the German suffrage movement had an impact around the world. So yeah, this was a really cool profile. I've had a lot of people who I've shown this to that have asked if we can create a concept for their project for it. If you want to do something with this, it's really important to think about how you actually need 3 sets of data to kind of build up the story. So the first set of data that we have is really kind of almost a timeline, what we've built here. There's a second layer to it in that you have the pink, the green, and the purple, which shows the pink is sort of the socialist movement, the green is the civic or the bourgeois movement, and the purple is our radicals. So we had that sort of layer of information. And layer 2 is kind of the biographies of the people. So if we're thinking about layer X is the time, layer Y is the people, and then we have X, Y, Z. So the last layer of things is really those moments where they kind of intersected. So to create something like this, you really need a multi-level story to sort of think about it. But then we also had the request, what about making that black and white? So there's a newspaper here in Berlin. They're a digital newspaper called Kraut Reporter, and they approached us to kind of create a graphic for a special newspaper that they were doing, that they were going to make it once a year, and it had to be in black and white. And it also had to be in a very simple graphic form because it was being printed on sort of what you guys see here, this printer of it's a printer from the 1920s, and it's still done with the blocks and things like that. So this created a very special design challenge for us, and one where we just didn't think that we could kind of recreate this colorful, very picture focused graphic, because to create those photographs was impossible with the machine we were working with. So what we did is we looked at the other side of the right to vote, and we looked at the right to be elected, because that came at the same time for German women. And we had a wide broadsheet, it's a big newspaper, and we broke down by year, by parliament, the parties, or the percentage of votes that every party had, and percentage of members of parliament that every party had, and how many of those were women and how many of those were men. We chose like that women would be represented as the black because we loved how this kind of added to the story of women breaking through those houses of power especially is what you kind of see in the 1990 to 2017 column, especially when you're looking at 1994, you really see the green column kind of like punching through. We also looked at the comparison between East Germany and West Germany, and we saw that East Germany had far more women, but, and so it looks like democracy isn't good for women as it's presented, but I would also say that the party, or the places where the women were, was not where the power was held in East Germany. So yeah, so we broke through every year, and then we were able to sort of create a graphic that still kind of told a story, that was still focused on the topic, but we were able to do so for black and white. And yeah, and we were able to kind of create it for this print thing. And actually I can show you, it's right over here, what that wound up looking like. So you can stop my share so I can be bigger on your screens, maybe. So this was the newspaper here, so you can see it's quite large. And our graphic looks like this. So you can kind of see, we again sort of used the opportunity of a newspaper, looked at how people read a newspaper versus how people read online. And with a newspaper, especially one like this, where it's kind of a special edition, where it's a lot of like text and big, and it's something special that people are taking in their hands. And we could kind of create something again and think about how do we create something that people can kind of pore over and explore and look at in detail versus something that can people understand the meaning from when they're scanning through it, like you do when you're looking at the web. But at the same time, through the black and white, I'll share my screen again so we can see it. Through the black and white presentation that we have, and by looking at the, you can kind of see the graphic too in the first glance, what we're kind of looking at as well. So you can kind of quickly understand it. And so creating that kind of understanding is the challenge, while it's still inviting people to sort of take part in exploring. So that's how we sort of did that, took that story, or took that data set, or took that story and took it from digital to a print format. We worked with a lot with data, and we were always interested in exploring data and seeing what kind of data points we had. And we had this one, which was sort of shipping routes from, I think, the 1600s up until 2018. And it created this really interesting picture. But as we started looking at the data and critically analyzing the data, we found that there's probably a lot of data missing. This was coming from a few countries. It was coming from Holland. It was coming from Britain. There was some stuff from Spain. So we were only sort of seeing ship records that was from those countries. We weren't seeing anything that was happening in Asia, which is why most of the traffic in the beginning looks like it's transatlantic, but we're not seeing any of the Pacific traffic that we could have. And we just said, there's not enough here to really create a story. We didn't have enough clean data to sort of really sort of be able to pick out specific routes, what things we're doing. We looked to see if we could do the trade, slave trade and other kind of things that we could do in there, but it just wasn't there. So what we did see though, is in this one time period, traffic stopped in a very specific area and then caused the traffic to go around the Horn of Africa. And around the Cape of Africa. And this was the time that they blocked the Suez Canal. And that, again, like the story with the women's election, made us sort of think about a lot of different questions that we could ask with it. We thought about, how did they block the canal? What did this do with the canal structure? So we looked at it from an engineering standpoint. We looked at it at a political standpoint in terms of, was there chaos as a result? We also looked like from an economic standpoint, what was the price of goods? Which economies were most affected by this? What did this cost to create all of this traffic to go so much further around the world instead of just through the Suez? What happened to the ships that were expecting to be en route for this many days and suddenly had to be en route for double that time? You know, were there stories of people running out of supplies on their ways? We also looked at it from a biological standpoint, like did we see any changes in the biome, like in the fish or in the plant life that was available in the canal? And instead, we kind of came across the story about the ships that actually were stuck in the Suez Canal during this period. So while everything else was happening and there was a lot of stuff going on around the canal, actually within the canal, there was this community of ships that that just nothing happened. And this community of ships then wound up building up an actual little camaraderie, managing to keep themselves away or keep themselves sort of sane. They kind of got stuck there thinking that they were going to be there for a couple of weeks. And instead they were there for, I think, 8 years in total. The crews wound up sort of cycling themselves out, but we used a kind of a comic book style to tell the story of people and move our way through the story as that goes along. We found out that they had their own Olympic ceremonies, that there was war going on around them, but everyone survived. We looked at kind of what happened and how many ships actually made it out of the canal. For us too, it was great that they were two German ships that were the only ones to make it out of the canal under their own power. But this is another example of how, when you're looking at data, it's important to ask yourself a lot of different questions that can kind of help you discover something unexpected and something really interesting and something that's an engaging and, again, human story for your platform. What's also interesting when you're looking at data stories is that sort of create something new to use the possibilities of digital to create something that's more engaging. When I was a reporter at the Handelsblatt Global, it was at the time that this building, the Elbphilharmonie, opened. And this is a symphony house in Hamburg. And when it opened, everyone was like, this is the best acoustics in the world. And at the same time, you have another concert house that's being built, and they're like, this will be the best acoustics in the world. And for me, I was like, well, what does that even mean? How can you even measure the best acoustics in the world? Because this felt like something that was very subjective to me, how you hear things, or, we hear things differently. And then when you look into acoustics, you've got like a bunch of really ugly graphics that, unless you have the information or the knowledge of what this is, you don't know what this means when you're looking at it. I remember something about cos and sine from high school, but not more. So we wanted to take scientific data and make it to something that music lovers could enjoy. So with digital, we have the advantage of animation, which is perfect for a story like this. And you can kind of let it play through. You can see how sound moves throughout the room, throughout the graphic. You can show how conditions change these things, and sort of see how the points of perception are. And we can also blow this up further, where we could look at various concert halls, look at the conditions, and make something that's easier for people to explain, for people to sort of listen in with, not listen in, we didn't have sound, unfortunately, but to create that kind of thing. This is also something that we did for our book, and I bookmark it. I did not. The kids moved the bookmark. But I'm sure it's in science. That should be, yeah. So when we had to so this was obviously a challenge when we were looking at how do we change this into something static, because this was a story that we created digital first, and then turned it into something that would be print once Jan Schwacho, who is the founder of the infographics group, secured the deal for the book. So I don't have the PDF of it, unfortunately, but I do have the book. And that's playing out. No, that's not it. That's not it. Just see where it is. Yeah, so when we were looking for it in the book to create it, we had to sort of think again about how do we make this as something that works as a static graphic. So it won't let me find it. But yeah, so we had to kind of break it down even more and sort of hope that with layers of imagery, we can kind of create something that would do just what the animation would do. But obviously the animation, when you're looking at digital, works much better. Where did the, yeah, I'm gonna try and find it later. So yeah, so we also worked with quotes, we worked with experts to sort of kind of create some emotion for the story as well. And yeah, and that's how we kind of looked at acoustics. And this way I was also able as a journalist to finally answer a question that always bothered me whenever I had to write about the concert hall in Hamburg, why it has the best acoustics in the world. And from a design and storytelling kind of standpoint, we could just sort of stick with something that was easy, or that was easier for music lovers to understand. So since leaving the infographics group, I have been working out of the office from Figures, which is a small design studio here in Berlin. There's a few other people who also left the infographics group. And when we started talking, they had just done this graphic about Overshoot Day. And they had created this graphic, and I'm just going to jump into their Instagram profile now because that makes it easier than showing it this way. And so when we have this is their Instagram profile. And when they started, they had just come up with this graphic, again, for Instagram about Overshoot Day. So how much we were using, how much more resources that we were using in the planet than the planet can kind of give us in a year. And they broke it down and they sort of looked at what's causing the carbon, or what's causing this overshoot, where are our resources being used? And they sort of said, okay, this is what's happening. And when I looked at it, I said, okay, but so what? Like, what is this? What does carbon mean? What is producing the carbon? What is, what about grazing land? Why there are things that are staying relatively static, but other things like carbon and cropland that are kind of going up a lot, especially carbon. So we kind of came up with this idea of let's do more graphics where we kind of explain where these things are coming from. So one of the ones we did, we looked at streaming video and looked at to see how data centers that are feeding our things like Netflix or Facebook or Amazon Web Services are creating actually huge carbon usage. And we looked at it by the example of just Friends. So in 2019 or 2018, Friends was one of the top 3 most watched shows on Netflix. We had from a press release that 32.6 billion minutes were spent watching Friends, and we broke that down to explain how long 32.6 billion minutes is, which is 62,000 years, which is longer than any species that have related to us has been in existence. And then what we kind of looked at is, okay, here's the Netflix energy consumption. So all of Netflix's energy consumed was about 1% of it was just spent on the show Friends. And we could kind of then sort of calculate that all the energy that it was put into enabling you to watch Friends in 2018 could have also powered 551 houses in the UK. So finding data points that can kind of relate to each other, that can give people this moment of aha and oh, I get it, is really important, I think, to data storytelling. We also did the same thing when it came to various milk alternatives. So we looked at almond, dairy, oat, and rice and soy milk, and we looked at also their environmental footprint. And for that, the team created a little video that sort of showed the land usage and water usage. And in that way, you can kind of see how much dairy milk uses versus all the alternatives to plant-based milk products. So with that, you could kind of get a better understanding of whether these alternative products are really better than and here we also have an example of an animation that's a bit simpler, and it changes the relations to each other as well. So this is also something that you can almost kind of break apart and create a print graphic really easily. But they decided to create an animation for it so that they could better show off their skills, because this is also sort of a marketing platform for them. And I will now jump back into my presentation, because that's all I have to say about about my time there. And we're back here with our, so yeah, oops, got pushed back a bit. Got the acoustics we cleared. We've talked about my time with projects with figures. And now we're kind of going to this is my last story that I wound up doing for the infographics group, almost. And sort of the one I had the most fun with. So this is when we kind of had a data set that was really interesting, because it was a data dump of illegal data, login data, that had been leaked onto the internet in January 2019. And it was 10 billion data points. And we were working at the time with a data scientist named Sebastian Vollenhuis. And he kind of took this data, and without really me knowing about it, which is probably good, because I might have been like, oh, no, we shouldn't do it. But since he already had it, I was like, let's do something. So he was really interested in data security and figuring out what the passwords might say about us. So what he wound up doing is he wound up scrubbing all the password data from everything else, so that in the end, we didn't know where the passwords were coming from. We didn't know what sites they were being used at. We didn't know the email addresses associated with it, or any other relevant data. All we had was a set of passwords that just were words. And in the end, we created the story called Heat Score. Heat score is a word that is from my youth in Canada, that you're doing something that's kind of illegal, that you can totally get attention for, because it's, yeah. So if you were, doing drugs next to the library, which is also next to the police officer's headquarters, that was something we called heat score. And because we were taking this illegal data and visualizing it, we were also kind of heat score. And this is also where our GIF came from. We visualized our passwords into these series of heat maps. And with it was really interesting, because we could kind of see insights into how people are, and show how we're very unoriginal when it comes to creating our unique passwords when we're doing these things. So this first one that we see, when you look at the triangle, we're looking at passwords that are 3 letters long to, I think we had 27 was the last one. And when you're looking at this, this one shows the length of our passwords. And we see with the heat map that 28 or 8 letters is the size of most passwords that we're dealing with here, which isn't surprising, given that most sites tell us only to make a password that's 8 letters long. So we keep to the rules. And also, when you think about the word password, which is a very frequently used password in this set, that's also 8 letters long. So we could see that. This heat map shows us that we capitalize our passwords the same way we capitalize our names, capitalize the start of our sentences. In German, we capitalize the nouns. So we also capitalize our passwords, and we can see that this is something that is almost universally done in these passwords that we have. And then we came to this one, and this was the chart that got me the most excited about this story, because I said, what's happening here? Because we have these 2 lines in the longer passwords where we're seeing a very clear pattern of something being repeated. And so Sebastian kind of looked into the information, or looked into what was going on with that. And what he found was that people were actually using their email addresses as the password. And so what that lines are that we're seeing is the pattern of people saying @ and then you have 5 spaces, so Gmail or Yahoo, and .com, and the dot is the second part of it. So it was really interesting to be able to look at this very technical data and create something that was very human, and identify what was going on in these patterns, of human behavior by applying the language rules. And to sort of create further engagement, we also wound up building a search, and I'll show you how it works in just a second. So go back to this screen share. So here we have the story in the magazine itself. It's something that you can see. We scroll through and have a lot of information around it. See the big letters. We'll also see where numbers come up. So we like to put our numbers at the end of passwords. With the special characters too, it was quite frequently in the shorter ones up here. It's quite frequent that we put an exclamation mark at the end of our passwords. We like to make sure our passwords are exciting. And there you can see the Hotmail. So one of the things that we also did was we created a database. So this is one of the few stories that actually had an interactive element, which is also something that you can kind of consider when you're doing a digital story. So we did this where you just had to type in any kind of word, and you can kind of see how often this password came up in our database. So password itself had 22 million hits, but we also did it in a way that was felt secure. So password with a capital P is a totally different entry point. We can also try something like Moscow is 7,700 hits in this thing. But if we maybe try Oksana, look, even Oksana has 16,000 hits. So when we were looking at this, so when you're having like 10 billion, we had 10 billion passwords ultimately that we kind of categorized and grouped together. So when you see these things, we looked at all kind of different ideas of how we could do this too. We looked at, could we find baby name trends? Like if you had Jack 2010, or is that like something that we could read in passwords, since people frequently use children's names with their birth years together for passwords. We also looked at like terms of endearment. So cute names that you have for your lovers, like baby or princess or habibi, even if you're looking about Arabic. But yeah, obviously when we looked at doing this for print, so this is one I do have in the book, we kind of had to think about how can we rearrange the graphics a bit differently. We also decided to create a prioritization in this case. So in this case, we used the special characters one, where we also had that surprising element of the passwords being used in the email address. And then we kind of set the focus otherwise on like other major trends that we could see. We also included a graphic down here at the bottom that kind of prioritized or sort of showed the different letters that were or the different characters that we were using in them, and highlighted them in a way that kind of brought them to the forefront. But again, because we're talking about books, we were able to sort of create something more, you know, by user behavior, that if you have a book that is this thick and this big, you also want to be able to give people who buy this kind of thing are going to spend time with it, and they're going to explore the pages. So when you're thinking about print, you want to think about how can I create a page that's easily to explorable, and sort of engaging and kind of like feeds into the reader mindset, versus when you're creating something for the web, you're starting something like, how can I send information as fast as possible into these people's brains, because they're just going to be swiping through as much as they can. So that's that. And so those are the sort of the main things to kind of consider when you're doing that. And when you're kind of, I'll jump back up here. And when you're kind of like doing these stories, I'm looking at the data set, and basically I am just looking at how and why. What is driving the changes? What is the cause of patterns? What is the behavior that's kind of going on behind those curves and twists and changes? Of course, this drove everyone crazy, and they were always sort of like, why can't we just make it look beautiful? And I said, no, that's not good enough. And so, yeah, everyone had to deal with it. But in order to get everyone on board, it was really important that we developed a story, because the story is key to kind of making all the decisions that we had sort of to do all of this and finding that story. And to find that story, you have to ask the how and the why behind it. And when people came to me with a story idea, I would always kind of ask two questions. What's the point? And who cares? And these two stories, you're creating, you're finding sort of the point of the story. You're looking at what aspect of the story to talk about. And that's further specialized by who cares, like who are you telling the story to? If I'm talking about the acoustics, it was interesting to not talk about to scientists or engineers, but rather music lovers. When I'm talking about passwords, I want to talk about everybody, not just parents. So it was interesting to me to sort of think about what are the patterns that we're seeing in all the passwords, and sort of create, and that kind of helped me shape the storylines and the storyboards, and also helped designers, developers, engineers, data scientists, everyone that I was working together with kind of make decisions to address those two questions. So when I'm looking at what's the point, it helped me sort of establish things like where to start, what format do we work with this, what platform do we use? Is Instagram the right platform? Is an interactive scrollytelling the right platform? Or would you rather do it for video? And I think what's also really important is that this helps us decide what to leave out. So obviously when we have a lot of data, when we have a lot of places that we can take the story, it helps us kind of edit that out. When it comes to who cares, it helps us decide what's the language we use, and not just, you know, English versus German, but rather how simple do we present this language? How we speak to children or how we explain a picture of a butterfly to children is also completely different to how we explain a butterfly to a flower lover. So thinking about who cares helps us sort of steer that language. It helps us decide design just as much, because again, for children, we would design differently than we would design for scientists. Platform as well, who do we want to tell this story to? And again, what to leave out. Children aren't interested in maybe all of the details that a scientist is interested in, or maybe we wouldn't use the scientific name for a children's thing, but talk about things in terms that they understand. We would talk about the nose and the eyes and the ears, whereas for a scientist, we'd talk about something else. So that's pretty much it for me, and that's kind of how we kind of created these stories. And I hope you have questions. I hope I didn't speak too quickly. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Sparring talk. So you can give me back the host rights, I think. And ребята, у кого есть вопросы? Надя, ты будешь первая? Questions. It's time for Q&A.
Да, наверное, сейчас задам. Sabina, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very, very important for me. I didn't understand what about project with music, and please explain what exactly did you in this project with music? Is it a concert hall decoration or something something other?
No, yes, thank you. Yes, with that one, we looked at just the architecture and engineering of a concert hall, because today acoustics, so how we hear sounds or how sound moves around in a room, is something that is very scientific and highly engineered. And this makes it a very specialized area of knowledge, but music has a very wide audience of lovers. And a concert hall is very important for music lovers, and it's something that is very important for engineers and acoustic architects to design well. So what we wanted to do with this story was look at what are the decisions that an engineer makes that improves the experience of a music lover, and can you perfectly engineer this experience for a music lover or not? And so this is what we were kind of trying to measure or illustrate
taking this highly scientific and highly specific piece of knowledge and looking at how can we create something that's more accessible for the music lover who maybe doesn't understand or doesn't remember or isn't interested necessarily in going in depth to understand the way that they present it. Did that help?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So it was something like a video.
Yeah, so we use small
projections or something.
No, it was just a concert hall. So so like somewhere where you would have a philharmonic orchestra or a symphony orchestra or even an opera. And what we found was even cinemas, orchestras, philharmonics, choirs, opera houses, they all have different requirements for acoustics. And we can kind of explain why that was using this kind of graphics that we did.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, there is a question, if possible. So I just want to clear up the situation of commission, whether the subjects that you're selecting are your own choice or it is somehow spoken beforehand after you get the brief, or in what kind you get this brief, what kind of a brief you are having at the beginning?
Yes, that's a good question. We were very lucky when we were doing this project in that we could kind of decide our own commissions for this. But at the same time, we had to change how the team approached these stories before to sort of where it was very print focused before to something that was digital, and reconsider who consumes a website like this. We did have several stories that we always looked at. And in the end, so unfortunately the magazine isn't being developed further at the time because of the funding problem, because to create stories like this is quite expensive when you think about the team that goes into it. But we wanted to give it a shot, and we had the opportunity and a sponsor who was willing to give Infographics Group the opportunity to kind of create something like this and see what happens. And so we wanted to create stories that were engaging. When we chose stories, we always thought about, you know, what is their relevance? We looked at a lot of stories that were tied to a specific time or history. So when the moon landing anniversary happened, we had a few stories related to that. And otherwise, and when we look at the gold price story, for me, that was an easy commission or decision to make, because I wanted to find new stories that would have some staying power. So things that always happen over and over again. The price of gold goes up every time we have an economic crisis in the US. And so that meant every time this thing would happen, we could show that the story was still relevant. So it was always a process where the decision was always sort of lay with Jan Schwocho, but I would kind of screen them first as well. And we were very collaborative in the team. Anyone was allowed to come up with an idea. And a lot of ideas got turned around, especially when we were looking at the stuff from the magazine. In that case, everyone could kind of go their own way and do something. So they would usually sort of find a couple of weeks where there wasn't much to do in the agency side, and everyone could kind of create this graphic. For example, here someone took a graphic to explain the difference between Martin Luther King and Martin Luther, or here we have a graphic showing the Millennial Hole, the tunnel in Switzerland. So it was always kind of a wide range of stories that we were showing that would sort of explore these topics. But in the end, we did have criteria deciding in terms of what's relevant. It's kind of going back to some questions of what's the point and who cares, and is this relevant for our audience, is also part of that kind of decision making.
So may I understand it in such a way that in most of the cases you suggest the story? And
no, it was our team suggested the story.
Well, yes, your team.
Yeah.
So yes, because it's a very interesting area of creative work, to tell generally, we can assume that today infographics and data telling is a way of exploring mankind in general.
Yes.
And so you have to have a lot of ideas and data in advance somehow.
Yeah.
Like a library of events or library of facts, which you can combine later on in different combinations, telling about the Autobahn story or acoustics or some other like the Suezki Channel story.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is also where being a journalist was a very important or very good background for me to bring into this job. Because as journalists, you're never really an expert of anything except for maybe telling the story. But you pick up all of these pieces of information as you go along. So in the stories that I showed of my experience there, I had written about sort of the emerging alt-right movement in Germany. I wrote about patriotism in Germany for the 4th of July and why that's sort of an uncomfortable situation here. And then I also wrote about craft beer and how that scene was finally coming out in Germany. So, you know, with all of these different areas that I explored, it kind of helped me look at things, and it also made me a very big reader. So when a designer would come to me and say, I want to do a story about pangolins, these little like armored animals, I would ask her, well, what do you want to do about pangolins? Like that pangolins is a very broad category. In the same way that we looked at the data from the ships on the Suez Canal, we looked at various things. And I said, well, one thing I remembered reading about pangolins in a newspaper was that they were the most trafficked animals in the whole world. And maybe can we explore that as a data set? So yeah, you do need to have kind of this idea of what people are saying. And it was always sort of this collaboration between someone who is bringing a passion project or a passion or a deep interest in something and finding something, okay, how can I translate your passion into something that would be interesting for a wider audience? And yeah, this was, I think, most of the work that I did in the end. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have some other questions, but maybe our participants would like to ask more, and I'll make a pause then.
Guys, come on.
Sabina, I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, what's the main difference in making infographics in print and in digital, and what form is your favorite? And how did you manage to solve the task with visualizing acoustics in print form? So I understand how you made it in digital because it's a very visual process, and how it was realized in print form.
Yeah, those are good questions. So print versus media. So I think when you're thinking about how to create, I'm also looking for the print version of this while I'm talking. That's why I'm not looking at the camera. But to think about this in a print format versus digital, I think the biggest way is to look at how are people consuming your information. So when you have a book or when you have a newspaper or something, people put more effort into obtaining something that they read or something physical than they do in what's digital. Digital, we take for granted. We scroll, we swipe, we consume. And so when we're making the decision for digital versus, there, I found it. When we're looking at sort of the decisions for digital versus print, we really think about the difference in how people look at a print product or a print infographic and turning that into. That being said, there are some very clean, very neat print graphics out there that work much more like a digital one when you're looking at a newspaper. So one I'm thinking of is there's one from the New York Times that won a lot of awards where they traced how the California fire spread through the state by a time point. So it was a timeline as well as a map at the same time. And this was something that worked as a static graphic because they showed it with various degrees.
They showed how they were able to show growing through differing opacities. So how thick the color was to how, to sort of as it spread out through the edges. When we did the acoustics one, so here it is, you can see that we also did sort of the same thing. They worked with how thick the material is, or how thick the color saturation is. Sorry, the sunlight is very bright right now. So that where the color or where the sound went the most, that's where we had the thickest application of color. And by doing so, we sort of show as well. So here's that one graphic, which is very gets very detailed and very color oriented in that. And in this point, what we did was we reduced it a lot to sort of show a single data point more and focused on how it reached a user or a listener. So we put the listener much more in focus point rather than sort of having the lines kind of go all over the place. And so, yeah, so it's making those decisions is always not easy. It usually means editing. So cutting things out rather than adding more to things. And it's also, it's an aesthetic question as well. How do you like your pages to look? Do you prefer your pages to be all full and crowded, that people can kind of explore them? Or do you like, I mean, here's a great one too. This is about marathon running. So here they've explored like several data points on one page, all to a single topic, but without really a central story. But it does give people an idea of how marathon running has developed through time. So I think as long as you have a focus, whether it's marathon running data or a certain area of how sound moves through space, it can be easier to sort of make that decision. As for what my favorite is, I don't have a favorite. Maybe I should say I have a favorite and it is digital. I like doing print projects. I like sometimes being limited by conditions like we were with this, sort of thinking about it in black and white only. So we weren't allowed to play with color. So that was one tool of the infographics that was not part of it. Thinking about what could be modular, what could be blocky, what could be built and sort of printed on this great machine was another kind of restriction. Sometimes those restrictions can make it very, make you be very creative in how you tell the story. Another idea, also with my Instagram story, that was something that we couldn't create a website for it. So I had to get creative with what can I do? What's something existing that I can create? And so really for me, my favorite projects are always something where I've created something surprising and unexpected or found a new way to tell a story.
Yeah, I see. Thank you very much for your answer. It's very interesting. And how do you understand that this part of information should be cut out so that it's odd?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think requires practice and time.
Yeah, I see.
But the best way to learn it, I think, is cut out too much, or cut out what feels to you as too much and give it to somebody who's never seen it before to read and see what questions they're asking. So test readers, asking your mom, asking your little brother, asking people around you who haven't been involved in the creative process is a really great way to sort of see what's too much and what's too little. If they're asking, and listen to the kind of questions they ask you and what do those questions tell you about your work. So if they say, oh, if you're looking at the gold graphic and you say, oh, you have a picture of the mining, but what does this have to do with that? What does the mining map have to do with the price of gold? Does that have an influence? What you've done then is you've added a piece of information that's creating a question, and you're distracting from your story. So making sure that you stay focused on the story you want to tell, if it's the price of gold through time, will help you sort of make that decision. And when you're adding a new piece of information, ask yourself, is this part of the story or will this create a new story?
Yeah, I get it. Thank you.
Если нет вопросов, можно еще помучить.
And can I ask you a question?
Hi, please.
Hi. Firstly, I want to thank you for your presentation. And I didn't understand like everything, but I will definitely rewatch it later and try to understand everything you said in it. And also, I wanted to ask you, is the way you collecting data is a fixed procedure, always some fixed procedure? And if it is, what steps do you have in collecting data? Or is it some individual, or it's turned into individual something for every project? And also, if it is a fixed procedure, what sources do you use, and how do you choose sources for your projects?
That's a good question. So data collection really depends on the story and the kind of data that we're collecting. In most of the cases, it's always been different. So we've worked with stories where like a computer engineer has built a scraper and scraped the data from the back end of things on more of a hacky side. Sometimes you just find a government database or even a private database that someone has made available on, for example, Reddit. Also some great newsletters like Data is Plural is one that sort of gives people data sets that they are looking for on the web. And sometimes that data gets presented as a spreadsheet that you can kind of play with and explore and create very simple bar charts out of to sort of see where are the patterns or where are the spikes. And other times we have data that's in a very messy format, like we had with the ships. So that data requires a lot more cleaning. So to answer your question, it is a very individual process. And for the story, depending on where we got the data from, where the source is, and all of that. And where we find data, everywhere. Sometimes we would make the data ourselves and sort of like collecting the data, what we did. So for example, with my, with this project here, there was no central data set for this. I had data sets from before World War II. I had data sets for after World War II in the two periods, and then I had a data set for post reunification. So in that case, it required me to go through various lists. For pre-World War I or pre-World War II, I had a book that had placed the information online. So all I had to do was actually double check that because it was an older book. I wanted to make sure that it was in line with what I had found in more modern or government sources. For the post-World War II, everything that had come from West Germany was the same source as reunification, and that was the official government. So I took that, I mean, in Germany, I can say that's a trustworthy source. So I can take that information. And what then became more interesting is when I was looking at the makeup of the East German parliament. And for that, I only had on Wikipedia a list of who was in government. And it did not say whether they were men or women. But what happened then is our computer scientist, Sebastian, the same one I worked with on the password story, he wound up taking this list, this Excel sheet that I had of names, and asking a computer to sort it by male and female to a database of names that had already gendered the names. So instead of me having to go through and like make a little stroke between male and female, which is what I was starting to do, he ran it through a computer that then gave me a spreadsheet where I could separate everything by name, by party, by year. So it took me a lot of work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Sabine, so you always make your personal research with all your projects? And what about your team? Is it a big team? And how is the process of creating something for new project?
It was always a little bit different, but we really tried to keep a certain workflow with things. We had, when we were launching info.graphics, is what I can speak to the best, because at that point we had a core team of myself as editor. I also had I think 6 graphic designers who were sort of dedicated to it. We also had the engineers developing the back end. That was 4 of them. We had a product owner and me, and we were kind of the central points talking between tech and editorial. And there were also, I think, one full-time researcher plus myself as a researcher as well. So it was always a big team, and depending on how many people worked on a story, depended on the story. So for when we look at Heat Score, a lot of that work was done between Sebastian and I in terms of creating the concept and the content. And then we had an art director and a designer, or a creative director and a designer, who kind of turned it into the more visually appealing thing of what we wound up presenting. And then, sorry, my cat is making a lot of noise. And then we had other stories. So one of the stories on the site that took the longest was, I'll share it, and was, oh, you've disabled it. So Oksana will just have to share the link. One of the stories that we did the longest was, we looked at the Berlin airlift. So this period where the East had tried to shut down East Berlin from Western resources and tried to basically, or no, West Berlin got shut down by the East so that they can sort of overtake West Berlin as well. And there is a sort of convoy of planes. And we took one story that was in the magazine that was just a huge chart and wound up turning it into this like very epic comic book almost of stories. And it took us, I think, maybe 4 months, and probably longer if I'm looking at the research that we did in addition to all of the stuff that we did. And, you know, it wasn't 4 months of full-time work for everybody, but it was kind of this process where we make the decision, we create the storyboard, the research kind of gets put into to sort of support the storyboard. That research will include things like visuals, images. So especially if we're working in a historical story, we want to look at uniforms, fashion, buildings, maps. What did the streets look like then? All of these kinds of elements that were relevant to the story was kind of researched to sort of help the graphic artist visually recreate that. And then it would just kind of go into the design process, and depending on how long or how short we made the story, it would be sort of done. We also had stories that were done within like 2 days, or not 2 days, but just with 2 people, whereas like it was very simple. So we did one about how figs may or may not have a dead wasp inside, and we talked about how that happens. And it was a very quick and easy script that I could kind of write, and then the animator illustrated it, and then it was done. So yeah, it took a bit more time with the illustrations, but it was a 2-person job in the end. So depending on how much research we do, how big the story is, that's how big the team is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Then, while everybody's thinking, may I ask another question? So we saw different graphic design approaches to your charts, with puppies, with small cars like animated toys, with music represented on a dim violet gray background, with channel story more like pop artist, brutal graphic style. So do you have any influence on the way it comes out, or you give just full full freedom to your designers. How does it come like that?
That depends on the designer and how much I trust them.
So you work mostly with different authors all the time.
Yeah. So no, I mean it was really you know, we usually talked about different styles or different ideas of what we wanted to do with it, but in that area,
influence on the style.
Sometimes I would have influence. Like there were some. I mean, if I could, I remember when we did for this story, for example, we had different. The creative director really wanted to go with different patterns, like whether we do polka dots or what we do. Or lines, and we in the end we kind of decided on what was simple, what would work best with the technology we were working with. I could influence things if I could say, you know, this color, we shouldn't associate this color with this topic because of what it means. But most of the time, the infographic artists were very aware of these things. And yeah, sometimes like, yeah, I did trust them. And they had to trust me too. You know, they would often come to me with their story ideas or their storyboards, and they were always very shy about it because they knew they were only going to get half of it back, because I would do this process of elimination. For one script, someone had worked on something. She gave me 8 pages, and I said, and I literally gave her 3.5 back, and I said, this is the story. And so the trust went both ways. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I want to ask you my sick question too.
Yes.
About how long did you work on projects? For example, for 2 weeks, for 2 days, for a year? Please tell me.
Yeah. That was always different from project to project. Most of the projects that we were doing too, sometimes we would also have client work that would come in, like the agency also did get paid to do other things. So some projects would kind of get sucked up time-wise, because they would kind of be worked on and then put down, and then worked on and put down, and worked on, put down, which is why a regular workflow is very important, because then you always know where a project is when it gets picked up again, or if it has to be picked up by somebody else. But some projects definitely went on way too long. So for example, my women's rights or the voting rights project, what turned out to be the Instagram one, or to create that crazy wall in our office, I think we researched and sort of played around for almost 6 months with that idea. And that was partly, it wasn't, again, 6 full-time months. It was a lot of people picking up pieces and going with things. And also when we did that project, we made the mistake of not yet quite realizing our platform or where it would go when we were finished with it. We just had a pile of information. Once we made the decision to go forward with this Instagram concept, I think it maybe took about 4 weeks to sort of realize all the graphic elements to pare down the story so that it worked for Instagram, to create all the designs. There was also a series of animations that we used in the stories, like the Instagram stories, and that probably took 4 weeks to do that. And so, yeah, it was always very different how much I was involved with the story, how long a story took to be finished, just because it was always something that was almost an in-between time to create things. So, yeah, it was different always depending on how much research we put into it. Also, if there was already a print graphic and how much research we had to put into create a more current graphic for digital, and all of that. So yeah, it was different all the time.
Thank you. But it wasn't too crazy, yeah?
It had its moments, but coming from a daily newsroom, it was a different kind of crazy, you know? And, you know, with a daily newsroom, you have a deadline. You have to tell a story by a certain milestone. You had to kind of, you couldn't tell the story of the Notre Dame Cathedral fire 3 weeks after it happened. So yeah, we had, for me, it was a very different world to explore in that ways, because it was just, yeah, I had so much time all of a sudden.
Good.
Yeah, it was a luxury. It was a very luxurious project that I was able to work on.
Super.
Sabine, if you talk about social media, I have a new question. I'm very interested in that, and I can say that in Russia, in my personal research, they are more popular than internet websites, and even more and more popular. You talked about microsites on Instagram and your own project. And can you say, is it popular in Europe? For example, more popular than online shopping sector, or online journalism, or in politics? And when it is better to create microsites in Instagram, and is it convenient to follow the links?
Yeah.
Is it good?
Yeah, so with Instagram, social media, all these things, I think data visualization, infographics is very niche. What's interesting when you look at it, I don't think it's more popular on social media. I don't think data viz or infographics are more popular on social media than shopping or influencers or anything. But what is interesting on social media is that the community of infographic artists and data visualists are very engaged and very interested. So that's one thing to sort of keep in mind. I also think with social media, things change all the time. People who use social media change. How we use social media changes. One example is if you look at Instagram, it used to just be sort of pictures of food, and Twitter used to just be about, I just ate breakfast. And now we see how Instagram gets used to the slideshow function, where people are sharing blocks of text that kind of is news you can use. With Twitter, we see people exploring longer form writing through threads. So it really depends on how people are changing, how people are using it. I do find that Instagram is kind of limited in sort of how things get presented when you're looking at infographics. So one of the things that I brought into, I just want to try to find it. One of the things that I did when we were kind of creating our infographics for social media as we opened our channel was that I really let the graphics it's sort of out of the row right now, but I really let the graphics go through a whole row. And the original concept was that we would only work in blocks of 3, so that when you see the graphic in the feed, you can kind of see everything and scroll through it in a way that was easily readable. Because when you're looking at a small screen, designers often forget, what people are looking at. And if the text is this small, it's going to be really hard to see it on a screen. So yeah, I don't know if it's more popular. I don't know if it's also something that's not like a microsite. It's not something people see all the time on social media. So one thing I think I've definitely underestimated with my concept was that people don't necessarily get it. If I sit it down and explain to you how it works, you get it. But obviously with like this many users of Instagram on a daily basis, I can't sit down and explain to all of them how it works. We did create a story that would do that, but that doesn't necessarily mean. That being said, in terms of popularity, it's not necessarily that it got a lot of users, but the idea, the story, and the concept did get covered in the press. So a feminist newspaper wrote about it. And I've been also asked to speak at some conferences based on this graphic. So yeah, in that way, it did make an impact. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Александр Николаевич, еще вопросы?
Any more questions? No?
Any questions?
Oh, no.
Sabina, how many members are there in your team?
So when it was always a changing group of teams that worked on that website and worked on the stories. So the infographics group, or Sapera, when I left it was around 50 people, but that includes people who are doing the client services, people who are doing the finances, and all of that. So, but we did have, I would say, usually around 20 to 25 graphic designers who are working at that, and then 4 developers. Our editorial team, we had myself and 3 researchers to 2 researchers. That sort of changed, but they were, we had more editorial staff who were more focused on client work. But when we did, the only time that I had a fixed team was when we went into this launch production phase of info.graphics. And at that point, I think we were probably 10 people, maybe 12.
Oh, I think it's important to hear these figures because I was thinking about 5 or 10 people. So now I understand that there are more than 2, 5 or 10 designers, 20 or 25.
Yeah, so I mean, when we did the launch, we had 6 or 7 dedicated designers. I didn't even count in my 12 people, like necessarily the developers. So we had 4 developers working on the site and the back end. And we had researchers. I had 2 freelance writers who did some days as well to help me just write the stories. So yeah, that's what we had. It was a team. It required a lot of manpower.
And the question I asked was also dedicated to the graphic style, because I wanted to understand, is there a universal style for infographics, or the style comes out of the group of designers? And I was thinking about where they catch the inspiration for their graphics, from animation, from children's books, the graphic style that is formulating there, or maybe from the history of graphics of the whole culture.
All of those places, all of those places were things that we had inspiration from. So I remember there was one graphic we did on the price of oil, where the graphic designer referenced sort of this industrial Bauhaus design that came out of the 30s. We had other stories where people looked at, so when we did the women's rights votes, I wanted to create a murder board. So when you have crime or detective TV shows, you have this big wall of people with red lines everywhere. That was kind of our first inspiration. So the graphic styles very much came from the individual designers who did them. But of course, this was also an opportunity for them to explore and experiment and play. So if they wanted to try something different, they could. And as long as it fit to the story and as long as it fit to the audience, it was pretty much allowed. Obviously, if we were, or it wasn't going to get us sued, so that we weren't like creating Mickey Mouse or Disney characters one-to-one. That was another consideration we had to do. But yeah, a lot of inspiration was found on Behance or even Pinterest. Everyone had their mood boards from Pinterest that they were looking at. And yeah, usually when we would talk about a story, we would start talking about the colors, the moods, whether we would create vector graphics or whether we would work in 3D animations. This was all part of the discussions that we would constantly be having as we developed the story.
Well, I think it's important because it's a part of the data story.
Yes, very much.
The style of graphics.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So so when we did the password story, for example, we talked about, do we do it on a black background or a light background? And for that, because we were thinking about illegal, sort of the shadow world of hacking, we thought a Black background fit better to it than a white background would. And so even the kind of the theme or the story sort of would dictate some of the style decisions too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
How does the process of actioning with your customer works? So, I mean, do the customer come to you with the order that this firm needs an infographics, for instance, or you prefer to choose the theme for infographics yourself? So how does this process works? And how do you find the orders?
Mm-hmm. When we did client, or when the infographics group did client work, it was always different, depending on the relationship with the client. Some clients would come in and just say, here's a text. So we did, at the time we were working with Reclam, which is a book publishing, and they had a series of books that was 99 pages on 99 topics. And they would give us the 99 pages of words, and it was up to the graphic designer to read through it and choose what can we create to graphics to the theme of Dracula or David Bowie or whatever the topic was of the book. So in that case, there was a very trusting relationship for the team to make an editorial decision. Of course, the client got to approve that decision before we did. But yeah, with this newspaper, you know, we got introduced to them through somebody who was working with us. They told us about the project, and they asked us, yeah, if we did a page, what would that be about? So we gave them 3 topics that they could choose from. And so that's how we did it in that sense. We looked at, okay, it's 2019, what are the relevant, or 2018 at the time, what are the relevant informations? And we pitched 3 stories to them and they chose one. And again, they kind of trusted us to create the graphic and to create the story with it. But other times, like, people would come to us with a book and they say, this is the topics that we need. Here are the tables, this is the theme, this is the style. And then it was up to the graphic designers to fulfill that brief. So it depended on the client. It depends on what they were looking for and what they needed. And that's kind of how that, and that would sort of be up to the, yeah.
So you create a story for this company. So this is your main task to make these infographics. You find some clue story and try to represent it with some graphics. Yeah. And how does the background of journalist help you? So,
when you're a journalist, you don't just talk about what happened. So if you're at a protest as a journalist, you're not just standing there writing down, man in red shirt walks by holding sign, woman with small child holding hand, right? What? Because then you're just sort of saying what happened and not why. When you're a journalist, you don't talk about what you see. You talk about what you hear, what you see, what you experience, and you go and you talk to that man in the red shirt. You talk to the woman in the blue shirt. You ask the child what her idea is of what's happening at this protest, and you create an impression for the reader. And it's the same thing that I'm doing when I'm looking at sort of this data or the story or the idea. So that's the one side of it. The other side of it too is being a journalist and having always consumed newspapers has given me this breadth or this wide range of facts and knowledge that I can then use to sort of help me better understand what's going on in data and the more human side of it. And that idea of, I want to do a story about dogs, then I would say, okay, what about dogs do you want to do the story? And I would, could pull out a whole bunch of suggestions that would be about dogs and create a more focused story about it.
Yeah, so, I understand. Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thanks. Anything else?
Наверное, Сабину уже отпустить.
I have to wrap things up soon enough because I have kids to collect from school and things like that.
Thank you for your presentation. I think it was done like data storytelling with all this background of journalism and design and everything, because it was really very nice to see it just like a graphic style. Thank you. I think that all our students mentioned this. It's a real thing that they can keep in their mind when they will make their own presentations. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me as part of this group and for listening and giving me also and sharing your time with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you also for an opportunity to talk in English. It's a real pleasure, I think, for everyone here, and to listen to you.
Thank you. Yeah. And then thanks, Oksana, for inviting me to be part of this too. I really appreciate it. It's so nice to stay in touch with you.
Hope you see you.
All right.
Yes, take care and be healthy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everyone take care of yourselves, be healthy. I hope to see your data stories out in the internet or on the print pages one day soon. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Sabina.